A debt finally closed. London, 1918. Amelia Price witnessed an empty horse-drawn carriage gliding through the fog near the city outskirts, its wooden sides inscribed with the name Captain Edward Morgan. Chapter 1. The Phantom Carriage of Blackheath. The fog, a thick, gray beast, clawed at the edges of Blackheath Common, swallowing the skeletal branches of the winter bare trees. Amelia Price pulled her threadbare shawl tighter, the damp chill seeping into her bones despite the brisk pace she'd maintained since leaving the greengrocer's with her meager rations. The air hung heavy with the scent of coal smoke and something indefinably metallic, like the lingering ghost of blood. It was a scent that had become all too familiar in these last, brutal years of the war. She hurried along, her worn leather boots crunching on the frost-covered gravel path. The street lamps, dim and infrequent, cast feeble pools of orange light that barely penetrated the swirling mist. London, once a vibrant tapestry of sound and color, had become a muted city, shrouded in fear and uncertainty. Every rumble of a distant lorry, every unexpected shout, sent a jolt of anxiety through her. Even the familiar sounds of home, the creak of the floorboards, the tick of the grandfather clock in the hall had taken on a sinister quality, echoing the emptiness left by her husband, Thomas, lost somewhere in the muddy hell of the French trenches. Amelia hadn't heard from him in months. Not since that last, hastily scribbled letter, stained with what she desperately hoped was mud, and not something worse. The War Office had offered only polite, impersonal condolences, their words as cold and unyielding as the marble monuments springing up in every town square, each one a stark reminder of the devastating cost of this endless conflict. She was nearing the edge of the common, where the path dipped towards the row of modest houses where she lived, when she saw it. At first, she thought it was a trick of the fog, a phantom conjured by her weary mind and the pervasive gloom. But as she drew closer, the shape solidified, resolving itself into a horse-drawn carriage, stationary and silent amidst the swirling mist. It was an old-fashioned carriage, the kind rarely seen on the streets of London anymore, even before the war had choked the life out of the city. Its black lacquered wood gleamed faintly in the dim light, and the brass fittings, though tarnished with age, hinted at a former elegance. The horses, two magnificent black stallions, stood utterly still, their breath pluming out in white clouds that quickly dissipated into the fog. They didn't stamp their hooves, didn't toss their heads, didn't make a single sound. It was as if they, and the carriage itself, were carved from the very fabric of the night. Amelia's heart hammered against her ribs. A prickle of unease, cold and sharp, ran down her spine. There was no driver on the box. The carriage was utterly, eerily empty. And yet, as she strained her eyes, peering through the swirling mist, she saw something that made her breath catch in her throat. On the side of the carriage, etched into the wood in elegant, flowing script, was a name. Captain Edward Morgan. The name was unfamiliar, yet it resonated with a strange, unsettling familiarity, like a half-remembered dream. Amelia hesitated, her hand instinctively reaching out to touch the cold, smooth wood of the carriage door. A wave of dizziness washed over her, and she stumbled back, her hand falling to her side. The metallic scent, that unsettling odor of blood and something else, intensified, making her stomach churn. She wanted to run, to flee back to the relative safety of her small, empty house. But an invisible force held her rooted to the spot, her gaze fixed on the silent carriage. It was as if the carriage itself was waiting, expectant, a silent sentinel in the deepening fog. Who was Captain Edward Morgan? And why was his empty carriage haunting the fog-shrouded outskirts of London? The question swirled in her mind, as thick and impenetrable as the mist that surrounded her. She knew, with a chilling certainty that defied logic, that this encounter, this silent, spectral carriage, was not a coincidence. It was a summons, a prelude to something that would change her life forever. The war had taken her husband, her security, her peace of mind. Now, it seemed, it was about to offer her something else entirely, A mystery, a dangerous and unsettling secret hidden within the heart of a ghost carriage. And a name etched into the wood that felt like both the branding of a question and a future. Chapter 2. Whispers in the War Office. The next morning, the fog had retreated, leaving behind a sky the color of tarnished silver and a city still holding its breath. Amelia, after a restless night punctuated by fragmented dreams of black horses and a faceless man in uniform, found herself drawn back to the spot where she had seen the carriage. It was gone, of course. Only the lingering scent of damp earth and a faint, almost imperceptible indentation in the gravel path hinted at its presence. The image of the carriage, however, and the name Captain Edward Morgan were burned into her mind. She couldn't shake the feeling that it was somehow connected to Thomas, to his long silence, to the gnawing emptiness that had settled in her heart. Logic told her it was foolish, a desperate grasp at straws in a sea of grief, but the intuition, honed by years of navigating wartime anxieties, persisted. She decided to go to the War Office. It was a long shot, she knew. The War Office was a labyrinthine bureaucracy, a place where individual lives were reduced to numbers and files, where hope went to die a slow, agonizing death. But she had to try. She had to know if the name Captain Edward Morgan meant anything, if it held any clue, however small, to her husband's fate. The War Office, a hulking gray building near Whitehall, was a hive of activity. Uniformed men and women hurried through the corridors, their faces grim and determined. The air buzzed with the clatter of typewriters, the murmur of hushed conversations, and the ever-present sense of urgency that permeated wartime London. Amelia felt a wave of intimidation as she approached the reception desk, manned by a stern-faced woman with steel gray hair pulled back in a tight bun. I'm here to inquire about a Captain Edward Morgan, Amelia said, her voice barely above a whisper. The woman's eyebrows rose, a flicker of something unreadable in her eyes. Morgan? Are you family? No, not exactly, Amelia stammered, unsure how to explain her encounter with the phantom carriage. I saw his name. On a carriage. It's complicated. The woman's expression hardened. This is the War Office, madam. Not a place for idle curiosity. Unless you have official business, I suggest it's about my husband. Amelia interrupted, her voice gaining strength. He's missing in action. Private Thomas Price, 3rd Battalion, Royal Fusiliers. I haven't heard from him in months, and I believe Captain Morgan might know something. The woman's gaze softened, ever so slightly. The mention of a missing soldier, it seemed, had struck a chord. She sighed, the sound heavy with the weight of countless similar stories. Very well. Wait here. She disappeared into a maze of corridors, leaving Amelia to wait in the uncomfortable silence of the reception area. The minutes stretched into an eternity, each tick of the clock a hammer blow against her dwindling hope. Finally, the woman returned, accompanied by a young, bespectacled officer with a weary look in his eyes. Mrs. Price? He asked, his voice polite but distant.
I'm Lieutenant Davies.
I understand you have an inquiry about a Captain Morgan? Amelia repeated her story, the words tumbling out in a rush of desperation and confusion. She described the carriage, the fog, the unsettling feeling that had gripped her. Lieutenant Davies listened patiently, his expression unchanging. When she had finished, he paused, his gaze fixed on some distant point beyond her shoulder. Captain Morgan is a sensitive matter, Mrs. Price, he said finally, his voice low. His file is classified. I'm afraid I can't give you any information. Amelia's heart sank. But my husband, I understand your concern, Mrs. Price, Lieutenant Davies said, cutting her off. But I can assure you, Captain Morgan's activities have no bearing on your husband's situation. The 3rd Battalion has been involved in heavy fighting near Ypres. Casualties have been high. He didn't need to elaborate. Amelia knew what he meant. The unspoken words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. She felt a familiar wave of grief wash over her, threatening to drown her in its icy depths. Is there anything else you can tell me? She pleaded, her voice trembling. Anything at all? Lieutenant Davies hesitated, his gaze flickering towards the closed door behind him. He seemed to be wrestling with some internal conflict, his duty warring with a flicker of compassion in his eyes. "There is one thing," he said finally, his voice barely a whisper. "Captain Morgan was involved in intelligence work. Highly sensitive operations. Beyond that I can say no more." But he looked up and held Amelia's tear-filled gaze. "I would advise you, Mrs. Price, to forget you ever saw that carriage. Forget the name. For your own safety." His words, meant as a warning, only deepened the mystery. What was so dangerous about Captain Edward Morgan? And why was his name, whispered in the halls of the War Office, shrouded in such secrecy? The pieces felt wrong, angled, like a mirror reflecting the truth, but shattered. Amelia left the War Office with more questions than answers, and a growing sense of unease that settled like a stone in the pit of her stomach. She now had 2 wars to battle. Chapter 3. The Widow's Resolve. Lieutenant Davies' warning, far from deterring Amelia, had the opposite effect. It ignited a spark of defiance within her, a refusal to be swallowed by the fog of grief and uncertainty that had enveloped her for months. She was a widow, yes, in all but official confirmation. But she was also a woman of resilience, forged in the crucible of wartime London, where survival demanded a strength she hadn't known she possessed. She returned home, the small, silent house feeling even emptier than before. The scent of Thomas's pipe tobacco, faint but persistent, still clung to the air, a constant reminder of his absence. She wandered through the rooms, her fingers tracing the familiar objects: his worn leather armchair, the chipped teacup he always used, the photograph of them on their wedding day, their faces young and full of hope. The photograph. It was a stark reminder of the life they had shared, the future they had planned, a future that had been brutally ripped away by the war. But as she looked at Thomas's smiling face, she felt a surge of determination. She wouldn't let his memory be buried beneath the weight of official silence and classified secrets. She would find out the truth, no matter the cost. The War Office had offered nothing but dead ends. But Lieutenant Davies' words, his hesitant admission that Captain Morgan was involved in intelligence work, had given her a new direction. If Morgan was a spy, then he moved in a world of shadows and secrets, a world far removed from the official channels of the military bureaucracy. She needed to find someone who could navigate that world, someone who could shed light on the mystery of the phantom carriage and the enigmatic captain. Her thoughts turned to Mrs. Eleanor Cartwright, a distant cousin of Thomas's, a woman rumored to have connections to the less savory elements of London society. Eleanor was a flamboyant character, a former music hall performer with a sharp wit and a network of contacts that spanned from the highest echelons of power to the darkest corners of the underworld. She was also a woman who had little regard for rules or conventions, a quality that, in these desperate times, might be exactly what Amelia needed. Amelia had only met Eleanor a handful of times, mostly at family gatherings before the war. She remembered her as a whirlwind of energy and laughter, a woman who seemed to defy the constraints of her time. Finding her, however, wouldn't be easy. Eleanor had long since abandoned the respectable world of family gatherings, preferring the company of artists, writers, and other, more ambiguous figures. Amelia began her search in the dimly lit pubs and smoky backrooms of Soho, a district known for its bohemian atmosphere and its tolerance for those who lived on the fringes of society. She showed Eleanor's photograph, a faded image from a theatrical program, to bartenders, musicians, and anyone who looked like they might have a connection to the city's hidden underbelly. The search was long and arduous, a journey through a London that was both familiar and strangely alien. She encountered a cast of characters as colorful and diverse as the city itself: aging vaudeville performers, struggling poets, hardened criminals, and women who, like Eleanor, had carved out their own unconventional paths in a world dominated by men and war. Finally, after days of relentless searching, she found someone who recognized Eleanor. A gruff, one-eyed bartender in a dingy pub called the Serpent's Tooth nodded slowly as he examined the photograph. "Ellie Cartwright? Haven't seen her in a while," he said, his voice raspy from years of smoke and cheap whiskey. "She used to come in here regular, with a gentleman friend. A military type. Tall, dark, always wore a long coat, even in summer. Amelia's heart quickened. Do you know his name? The bartender shrugged. Never asked. They kept to themselves. But I heard whispers something about secrets, codes, messages, the usual wartime nonsense. He paused, his one good eye narrowing. Word is, Ellie got herself mixed up in something dangerous. Something to do with the war effort, but not the kind of thing they talk about in the newspapers. He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. If you're looking for Ellie, I'd suggest you try the Ravens Club. It's a private establishment, down by the docks. Not the sort of place for a lady like you, but that's where she used to meet her friend. He gave her the address, scrawled on a scrap of paper. Amelia thanked him, her mind racing. The Ravens Club. A private establishment. A military man in a long coat. It all seemed to fit, to connect to the mystery of Captain Edward Morgan and his phantom carriage. She knew she was stepping into dangerous territory, a world of secrets and lies where the stakes were high and the consequences could be deadly. But she had come too far to turn back now. She was no longer just a grieving widow. She was a woman with a purpose. A flicker of resolve burned brighter, warmer than it had in years. Chapter 4. A meeting at twilight. The Ravens Club was everything the one-eyed bartender had described, and more. Situated on a narrow, dimly lit street near the docks, it exuded an air of clandestine activity, a place where secrets were traded and deals were struck under the cover of darkness. The building itself was nondescript, a 3-story brick structure with grimy windows and a heavy, unmarked door. The only indication of its existence was a single, flickering gas lamp above the entrance, casting a faint, ominous glow. Amelia hesitated on the opposite side of the street, her heart pounding in her chest. She had changed into a darker, less conspicuous dress, borrowed from a neighbor, and had pinned her hair up in a severe style, hoping to appear older, more worldly. She knew she was taking a risk, venturing into a world she didn't understand, but the thought of Thomas, of the unanswered questions, spurred her on. Taking a deep breath, she crossed the street and approached the door. She knocked, the sound echoing in the silence of the narrow street. A moment later, a small, barred peephole slid open, and a pair of wary eyes peered out at her. "Yes," a gruff voice demanded. "I'm looking for Mrs. Eleanor Cartwright," Amelia said, trying to keep her voice steady.
I was told she might be here.
The eyes narrowed, scrutinizing her from head to toe.
Who sent you?
A mutual acquaintance," Amelia replied, improvising. "He said she might be able to help me with a matter of some urgency." The peephole remained open for a long, tense moment. Amelia could feel the weight of the unseen gaze, assessing her, judging her. Finally, the peephole slid shut, and she heard the sound of bolts being drawn back. The heavy door creaked open, revealing a dimly lit hallway and a large, burly man with a scarred face and a menacing demeanor. "Come in," he said, his voice devoid of warmth. "But don't cause any trouble. We don't tolerate trouble here." Amelia stepped inside, her senses on high alert. The air was thick with the smell of cigar smoke, stale beer, and something else, something sharp and metallic, reminiscent of the scent she had encountered near the phantom carriage. The hallway led to a large, dimly lit room, filled with a mixture of men and women, some in elegant evening wear, others in more discreet attire. The murmur of conversation, the clinking of glasses, and the strains of a melancholic piano tune created a strange, unsettling atmosphere. The burly man led her through the crowded room, his eyes scanning the faces, searching for someone. Finally, he stopped in front of a secluded booth, partially hidden by a heavy velvet curtain. "Wait here," he said, and then disappeared behind the curtain. Amelia waited, her nerves stretched taut. She could hear the muffled sound of voices from behind the curtain, a brief exchange in hushed tones. A moment later, the curtain was pulled back, and a woman emerged. It was Eleanor Cartwright. She was even more striking than Amelia remembered, her fiery red hair piled high on her head, her emerald green dress shimmering in the dim light. Her eyes, a vibrant shade of blue, were sharp and intelligent, assessing Amelia with a mixture of curiosity and amusement. "Amelia Price, isn't it?" Eleanor said, her voice surprisingly soft, with a hint of a theatrical lilt. "Thomas's wife. What a pleasant surprise. What brings you to this den of iniquity?" "I need your help, Eleanor," Amelia said, her voice trembling slightly. "It's about my husband, and a man named Captain Edward Morgan." Eleanor's smile vanished, replaced by a look of cautious concern. "Captain Morgan?" she repeated, her voice barely a whisper. "Where did you hear that name?" Amelia quickly recounted her story, starting with the encounter with the phantom carriage and ending with her visit to the War Office and the cryptic warning from Lieutenant Davies. Eleanor listened intently, her expression growing increasingly grave. When Amelia had finished, Eleanor was silent for a long moment, her gaze fixed on some distant point beyond Amelia's shoulder. The music in the room, the laughter, faded. "You've stumbled into something very dangerous, Amelia," she said finally, her voice low and serious. "Captain Morgan is not someone to be trifled with. He's involved in things that are best left alone." "But I have to know," Amelia insisted. "I have to know if he has any connection to Thomas's disappearance. I have to know the truth." Eleanor sighed, a mixture of pity and admiration in her eyes. "The truth, my dear, is a rare and precious commodity in this war, and sometimes it's best left buried." She paused, her gaze meeting Amelia's. "But I can see that you're not going to give up. You have Thomas's stubbornness, I see. Very well. I'll tell you what I know. But be warned, Amelia. Once you know the truth, there's no going back. And the truth might be more than you can bear." Her hand, adorned with a large emerald ring, closed around Amelia's own.
It was a cold, stark contact.
And in it, a silent exchange, a promise between two women, bound together with secrets. Chapter 5. The Captain's Scars. Eleanor led Amelia to a more private corner of the Ravens Club, a small, dimly lit alcove tucked away behind a velvet curtain. A single, flickering candle cast long, dancing shadows on the walls, creating an atmosphere of intimacy and secrecy. The sounds of the club, the music, the chatter, the clinking of glasses seemed distant and muffled, as if they were in a world apart. "Captain Edward Morgan," Eleanor began, her voice low and measured, "is, as your Lieutenant Davies so delicately put it, involved in intelligence work. But it's far more than that. He's a ghost, a shadow, a man who operates outside the usual rules and regulations. He answers only to a select few, and his methods are not always conventional." Eleanor paused, taking a sip from a glass of amber liquid that a waiter had silently placed on the small table between them. "I met him through a mutual friend, a man who moved in similar circles. He was intriguing. Tall, dark, with eyes that seemed to see right through you. And scars, not just physical scars, though he had plenty of those, but emotional scars, deep wounds that he kept carefully hidden." Amelia leaned forward, her gaze fixed on Eleanor's face. "What kind of scars?" Eleanor hesitated. "The kind that come from seeing too much, from doing things that haunt a man's dreams." He never spoke about his past, about his experiences in the war, but I could see it in his eyes, in the way he carried himself, in the way he flinched at sudden noises. "The carriage," Amelia said, the image of the phantom carriage vivid in her mind. "Do you know anything about it?" Eleanor nodded slowly. "It's his. Or rather, it was his family's. An old heirloom from a time before the war, before everything changed. He uses it occasionally. For meetings. For transporting sensitive materials. For disappearing." "Disappearing?" Amelia repeated, a chill running down her spine. "He has a talent for it," Eleanor said, a wry smile playing on her lips. "For blending into the shadows, for becoming invisible. It's a skill that's served him well in his line of work." And my husband?" Amelia asked, her voice trembling. "Do you know if he ever met Captain Morgan?" Eleanor's expression softened, a flicker of sadness in her eyes. "I don't know for certain," she said. "But it's possible. Morgan had dealings with many soldiers, especially those involved in special operations. He recruited men, gathered information, arranged things." "Things?" Amelia pressed. Eleanor hesitated, her gaze flickering towards the entrance of the alcove, as if checking for eavesdroppers. Let's just say that not everything that happens in this war is reported in the newspapers, Amelia. There are other battles being fought, secret wars that are just as brutal, just as deadly. She leaned closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. I heard whispers that Morgan was involved in a project. Something to do with a new weapon, a secret weapon that could turn the tide of the war. It was highly classified, top secret, and it involved recruiting soldiers with specific skills. Soldiers who were expendable. Amelia's heart sank. Expendable? She repeated, the word echoing the cold, impersonal language of the War Office. I don't know the details, Amelia, Eleanor said, shaking her head. But I know that Morgan was looking for men who were willing to take risks, men who weren't afraid to disappear. Men like Thomas. The implication was clear. Thomas, with his quiet courage and his unwavering loyalty, might have been seen as the perfect candidate for Morgan's secret project. A project that might have cost him his life. There's one more thing, Eleanor said, her voice heavy with a sense of foreboding. The last time I saw Morgan he was different. Haunted. He had received a letter. It bore the seal of the War Office, but it was different from the official ones. It had a black raven embossed on it. A black raven. The name of the club. The symbol of what? Death? Secrets? Betrayal? He seemed disturbed by it, Eleanor continued. He said he had to make a choice. A choice between duty and something else. Something he couldn't talk about. And then? Amelia asked, her voice barely a whisper. And then he disappeared, Eleanor said, her voice echoing the emptiness that Amelia felt in her heart. Vanished into thin air, like a ghost in the fog. Just like that carriage of his. Her words lingered, hanging in the candlelight. A choice. Duty. And something else. Amelia's mind started to build, to hypothesize. A choice that Thomas never had. Chapter 6. Beneath the lamplight. Eleanor's revelations had left Amelia reeling, her mind struggling to make sense of the fragmented pieces of the puzzle. Captain Morgan, a ghost in the world of espionage, a man haunted by his past and burdened by secrets. Thomas, possibly recruited for a dangerous, clandestine mission, a mission that might have led to his disappearance. And the Black Raven, a symbol of something dark and ominous, a connection between the phantom carriage, the secret letter, and the enigmatic captain. I need to find him, Eleanor, Amelia said, her voice filled with a newfound determination. I need to find Captain Morgan. Eleanor looked at her, a mixture of concern and admiration in her eyes. It won't be easy, Amelia. He's a master of disguise, a man who can disappear at will. And he's surrounded by people who would protect his secrets at any cost. I don't care, Amelia insisted. I have to try. I owe it to Thomas. I owe it to myself. Eleanor sighed, recognizing the unwavering resolve in Amelia's eyes. Very well, she said. But you'll need help. You'll need someone who knows the underworld, someone who can navigate the shadows and find the hidden paths. She paused, her gaze flickering towards the entrance of the club. There's a man, a former associate of Morgan's. He goes by the name of Silas. He's a dangerous man, Amelia, a man with a dark past and a questionable reputation. But he knows things. He knows where the bodies are buried, both literally and figuratively. Where can I find him? Amelia asked, her heart pounding in her chest. He frequents a gambling den near the docks, Eleanor replied. It's called the Shadow Hand. It's not a place for the faint of heart, Amelia. But if anyone can lead you to Morgan, it's Silas. Eleanor gave her the address, scribbled on a piece of paper, along with the warning. Be careful, Amelia. Silas is a slippery character. He'll help you, but he'll expect something in return. And he's not known for his patience. Amelia thanked her, her mind racing. The Shadow Hand. Another dangerous step into the unknown. But she had come too far to turn back now. She had a lead, a glimmer of hope in the darkness. She left the Ravens Club, stepping back into the fog-shrouded streets of London. The city seemed different now, transformed by the secrets she had learned, by the dangerous path she had chosen. The familiar sounds, the rumble of lorries, the distant cries of street vendors, the clatter of horses' hooves seemed to carry a new, ominous undertone. She made her way towards the docks, the air growing colder and damper as she approached the river. The streets became narrower, darker, more menacing. The gas lamps, few and far between, cast long, distorted shadows that seemed to dance and writhe in the fog. She found the Shadow Hand, a dilapidated building tucked away in a narrow alleyway, its windows boarded up, its entrance hidden behind a heavy, iron-studded door. A single, flickering lamp cast a dim, yellowish light, revealing a crudely painted sign depicting a skeletal hand holding a deck of cards. Amelia hesitated, her hand hovering over the door. She could hear the muffled sounds of music and laughter from within, the raucous sounds of a gambling den in full swing. She knew she was stepping into a world far removed from her own, a world of risk and danger, where the rules were different and the stakes were high. But she had no choice. She had to find Silas. She had to find the truth. Taking a deep breath, she pushed open the heavy door and stepped inside. The air was thick with the smell of stale beer, cheap tobacco, and sweat. The room was dimly lit, illuminated by a few flickering candles and a single, bare light bulb hanging from the ceiling. Men and a few women crowded around rough-hewn tables, their faces illuminated by the flickering candlelight, their eyes intent on the games of chance before them. She scanned the room, searching for a man who fit Eleanor's description. A man with a dark past, a questionable reputation, a man who knew the secrets of Captain Edward Morgan. A man named Silas.
It wouldn't be easy.
But then she noticed, in the corner booth, bathed in the faint glow of a shaded lantern, a figure.
A man.
Alone, staring into the darkness, as if it held something only he could see. Chapter 7. Letters from the Front. The man in the corner booth was indeed Silas. He was even more imposing than Amelia had imagined, a large, powerfully built man with a weathered face, a network of scars crisscrossing his cheeks and forehead, and eyes that seemed to have seen too much of the world's darkness. He was dressed in a worn leather jacket and a dark, stained shirt, his hands, large and calloused, resting on the table before him, a half-empty glass of whiskey at his side. Amelia approached him cautiously, her heart pounding in her chest. He didn't seem to notice her, his gaze fixed on some distant point, his expression unreadable. "Mr. Silas?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. He slowly turned his head, his eyes, dark and piercing, meeting hers. He didn't speak, merely raised an eyebrow, a silent invitation for her to state her business. "My name is Amelia Price," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Eleanor Cartwright sent me. She said you might be able to help me." Silas's expression didn't change, but a flicker of something recognition, perhaps, or amusement crossed his eyes. "Elia," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "What trouble has she gotten you into?" "It's about Captain Edward Morgan," Amelia said, the name feeling heavy and dangerous on her tongue. "I need to find him." Silas leaned back in his booth, his gaze scrutinizing her from head to toe. "Morgan, is it? That's a name I haven't heard in a while. What's your interest in him?" Amelia hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. She decided to start with the truth, or, at least, a part of it. "My husband, Private Thomas Price, is missing in action. I believe Captain Morgan might know something about his disappearance." Silas took a long swig of his whiskey, his eyes never leaving hers. "And why would you think that?" Amelia recounted her story, the encounter with the phantom carriage, the visit to the War Office, Eleanor's revelations. Silas listened patiently, his expression unchanging, his silence punctuated only by the occasional clinking of ice in his glass. When she had finished, Silas was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on hers. "You've stumbled into a dangerous game, Mrs. Price," he said finally, his voice low and serious. "Morgan is not a man to be trifled with. He's got secrets that could get you killed." "I know," Amelia said, her voice trembling but firm. "But I have to know the truth. I have to know what happened to my husband." Silas sighed, a hint of weariness in his eyes. "The truth," he said, a wry smile playing on his lips. "It's a slippery thing, especially in this war. But I might be able to help you. For a price." Amelia had expected this. Eleanor had warned her. "What's your price?" Silas leaned forward, his eyes narrowing.
"Information," he said.
"I need information. About certain activities at the War Office. About certain individuals who are involved in sensitive matters." Amelia's mind raced. He wanted her to spy for him, to betray her country, even as she sought to uncover the truth about her husband's disappearance. It was a dangerous proposition, a moral dilemma that cut to the core of her being. "I don't know," she stammered. "I don't know if I can." "You can," Silas interrupted, his voice firm. "You have access. You have a reason to be there. You can get me what I need." He paused, his gaze meeting hers. "And in return I'll tell you what I know about Morgan. About his project. About the men he recruited. About your husband." The offer was tempting, a dangerous bargain that could lead her to the truth, but at a potentially devastating cost. She thought of Thomas, of his unwavering loyalty, of the sacrifice he had made for his country. Could she betray that loyalty, even to find out what had happened to him? "I need time," she said finally, her voice trembling. "I need time to think." Silas nodded slowly. "You have time," he said, "but not much. Morgan is a moving target, and the clock is ticking." He gave her a location, a deserted warehouse near the docks, where she could find him the following evening. "Come alone," he warned, "and be prepared to make a decision." Amelia left the shadow hand, her mind reeling, her heart heavy with the weight of her decision. She walked back towards her home, the fog seeming to press in on her, suffocating her with its damp embrace. As she reached her street, she noticed a small, crumpled piece of paper lying on the doorstep. She picked it up, her heart skipping a beat. It was a letter, addressed to her in Thomas's familiar handwriting. The letter was old, postmarked months ago, from somewhere in France. It was one of the many letters he had sent her, letters that had somehow been delayed, lost in the chaos of the war. With trembling hands, she opened the letter and began to read. Thomas's words, filled with love and longing, with descriptions of the horrors he had witnessed and the hope he still clung to, brought tears to her eyes. But it was the last paragraph that made her heart stop. He wrote about a special assignment, a secret mission that he had been chosen for. He couldn't reveal the details, he said, but it was important, crucial to the war effort. And he was afraid. He mentioned a name that sent a chill down her spine. Captain Edward Morgan. The letter ended with a promise to return home to her, to the life they had shared. A promise he hadn't been able to keep. The letter was clutched to her chest. And Amelia realized. She no longer had a choice. Chapter 8. The Secret of Ashworth Manor. The discovery of Thomas's letter, with its chilling mention of Captain Morgan and the secret mission, had stripped away Amelia's remaining doubts. She had to find Morgan, not just for herself, but for Thomas, for the promise he had made, a promise that had been broken by the cruel realities of war. She spent the next day in a state of heightened anxiety, her mind replaying every detail of her conversations with Eleanor and Silas, every clue, every whisper, every hint of the truth. She knew she was walking a tightrope, balancing the need to find Morgan with the dangerous bargain she had been offered by Silas, a bargain that could compromise her loyalty and put her life at risk. She decided to focus on what she could control. Silas wanted information from the War Office, information about certain activities and certain individuals. She would have to be careful, discreet, but she had a legitimate reason to be there, a reason that could mask her true intentions. She returned to the War Office, the imposing building seeming even more menacing now, its walls holding secrets that could destroy lives. She approached Lieutenant Davies, the young officer who had initially warned her about Captain Morgan. "Lieutenant," she said, her voice steady despite the turmoil within her. "I need to ask you about my husband again. Private Thomas Price. I found another letter from him. He mentioned a special assignment." A secret mission. Davy's expression shifted, a flicker of surprise, followed by a carefully guarded look. "Mrs. Price," he said, his voice low. "I told you before, I can't discuss classified information. But this is about my husband," Amelia insisted, her voice rising slightly. "He's missing, possibly dead. I deserve to know the truth." Davies hesitated, his gaze flickering towards the closed doors of the offices around them. "Very well," he said finally, his voice barely a whisper. "But we can't talk here. Meet me at the Albert Memorial, at twilight." "Alone." Amelia agreed, her heart pounding with a mixture of anticipation and dread. The Albert Memorial, a grand, ornate monument in Kensington Gardens, a place of public mourning, yet also a place of potential secrecy. She spent the rest of the day preparing, gathering information, trying to anticipate what Silas might want, what questions she could ask without raising suspicion. She felt like a spy in a poorly written play, a novice thrust into a world of shadows and deception. As twilight approached, she made her way to Kensington Gardens, the air crisp and cold, the sky a tapestry of fading colors. The Albert Memorial, with its golden statue of the Prince Consort, loomed before her, a symbol of enduring love and loss, a fitting backdrop for her clandestine meeting. She found Lieutenant Davies waiting for her, his face pale and drawn, his eyes filled with a mixture of apprehension and pity. "Mrs. Price," he said, his voice low. "I've done some digging. Unofficial, of course. About your husband. And about Captain Morgan." "What did you find?" Amelia asked, her voice barely a whisper. Davies hesitated, his gaze sweeping the surrounding area as if checking for eavesdroppers. "Your husband was recruited for a special operation. Code named Project Nightingale. It was highly classified. Top secret." "Project Nightingale?" Amelia repeated, the name echoing the rumors Eleanor had mentioned, the rumors of a secret weapon. "It involved developing a new form of communication," Davies continued, his voice strained. "A way to send messages undetectable by the enemy. It was a long shot, but it had the potential to change the course of the war." "And Captain Morgan?" Amelia pressed. "He was the architect of the project," Davies replied. "He hand-picked the team. Your husband was chosen for his skills with languages. He was a natural." "But what happened?" Amelia asked, her voice trembling. "What went wrong?" Davies looked at her, his eyes filled with a deep sadness. "The project was compromised. There was a leak. Information fell into the wrong hands. The entire team was lost. Captured or killed." Amelia felt a wave of grief wash over her, a familiar pain that threatened to drown her in its icy depths. But amidst the grief, there was also a flicker of anger, a burning sense of injustice. "Who?" she demanded, her voice rising. "Who betrayed them?" Davies hesitated, his gaze flickering towards the darkening sky.
"That's what I don't know," he said.
"But there are whispers that it was someone high up. Someone within the War Office. Someone connected to Morgan." He paused, his voice dropping to a whisper. "There's a name that keeps surfacing. Ashworth. Lord Ashworth. He's a powerful man, a member of the War Cabinet. He had access to the project. He had a motive." Lord Ashworth. A name she hadn't heard before, a name that now carried the weight of betrayal, of potential responsibility for Thomas's death. "He has an estate," Davies continued. "Ashworth Manor. It's outside of London. It's heavily guarded, but it might hold the answers you're looking for." Ashworth Manor. A new piece of the puzzle. A new destination. A new danger. But it held the potential, too. The secrets of the entire operation. And the name of the betrayer. Amelia's mission became clearer. Silas would have his information. And she, in return, would have her answers. Chapter 9. A Dance of Shadows. The information from Lieutenant Davies, however fragmented and dangerous, had given Amelia a new focus. Lord Ashworth, a powerful figure within the War Cabinet, a potential traitor, the key to unlocking the secrets of Project Nightingale and Thomas's fate. And Ashworth Manor, his heavily guarded estate, the place where those secrets might be hidden. She met Silas at the deserted warehouse, the air thick with the smell of damp concrete and decay. He was waiting for her, his silhouette outlined against the faint glow of a single, flickering lamp. "You have something for me?" he asked, his voice a low rumble. Amelia hesitated, her hand clutching the small notebook in which she had scribbled notes, gleaned from her conversations with Davies and from discreet inquiries at the War Office. She had focused on information that seemed relevant to Silas's cryptic request troop movements, supply routes, rumors of internal conflicts within the military hierarchy. She handed him the notebook, her heart pounding in her chest. He took it, his eyes scanning the pages, his expression unreadable. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the dripping of water from a leaky pipe and the distant sounds of the city. Finally, he closed the notebook, his gaze meeting hers. "This is useful," he said, a hint of satisfaction in his voice. "But not enough. I need more. I need details." About Project Nightingale. Amelia's heart sank. She had hoped her initial offering would be sufficient, that she could avoid delving deeper into the dangerous world of espionage. But Silas, as Eleanor had warned, was not a man to be easily satisfied. I don't know much about it," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Lieutenant Davies told me some things, but it's highly classified." Silas smiled, a cold, humorless smile.
"Classified, yes.
"But not impenetrable. You have access, Mrs. Price. You have a reason to be there. You can find out more." He paused, his eyes narrowing. "I need to know the names of everyone involved, the location of the research facility, the nature of the weapon." Amelia felt a wave of fear wash over her. He was asking her to betray her country, to steal secrets that could have devastating consequences. But she also knew that this was her only chance to find out the truth about Thomas, to uncover the identity of the traitor who had sent him to his death. "I'll try," she said, her voice trembling. "But I can't promise anything." Silas nodded slowly. "You have 1 week," he said. 1 week to get me what I need. And then I'll tell you everything I know about Morgan, about Ashworth, about your husband." He gave her another location, a different warehouse, even more remote and desolate than the first. "Come alone," he warned, "and don't disappoint me." Amelia left the warehouse, her mind racing, her heart heavy with the weight of her decision. She had 1 week to become a spy, to steal secrets, to betray her country, all in the name of finding the truth. She spent the next few days in a whirlwind of activity, returning to the War Office, using her status as a grieving widow to gain access to files, to ask questions, to piece together the fragmented information she had gathered. She learned more about Project Nightingale, about the brilliant scientists who had been involved, about the innovative technology they had been developing, about the potential it had held to change the course of the war. She also learned more about Lord Ashworth, about his ruthless ambition, his political maneuvering, his close ties to Captain Morgan. She discovered that Ashworth had been a vocal opponent of Project Nightingale, arguing that it was a waste of resources, that it was doomed to fail. Had he deliberately sabotaged the project? Had he betrayed the men involved, including Thomas, to further his own agenda? The more she learned, the more convinced she became that Ashworth was the key, that he held the answers she sought. And the more determined she became to expose him, to bring him to justice, even if it meant risking her own life. As the week drew to a close, she found herself drawn back to Blackheath Common, to the spot where she had first seen the phantom carriage. The fog had returned, swirling around her, creating an eerie, unsettling atmosphere. She stood there, in the darkness, her gaze fixed on the empty space where the carriage had appeared. She felt a strange connection to that carriage, to Captain Morgan, to the secrets he held. She wondered if he was still out there, somewhere in the shadows, a ghost in the fog, haunted by his past and burdened by his choices. She knew she was playing a dangerous game, a dance of shadows with forces she didn't fully understand. But she was no longer afraid. She was driven by a fierce determination, by a love for her husband, by a need for justice. She closed her eyes and whispered into the fog, "I'm coming for you, Captain Morgan, and I will find you." The only answer was the wind. But Amelia felt at her bones. It would be enough. Chapter 10. The Informant's Price. The week had passed in a blur of clandestine meetings, furtive glances, and coded conversations. Amelia had become adept at playing the role of the grieving widow, using her vulnerability to mask her true intentions, to extract information from unsuspecting sources within the War Office. She had learned more about Project Nightingale, about the specific individuals involved, about the location of the research facility, a remote laboratory hidden beneath Ashworth Manor. She had also learned more about Lord Ashworth's connections to Captain Morgan, about a series of secret meetings that had taken place between them, meetings that coincided with the sabotage of Project Nightingale. The evidence, though circumstantial, was mounting, pointing towards Ashworth as the traitor, the man responsible for Thomas's death and the deaths of the other men involved in the project. She met Silas at the designated warehouse, the air even colder and more desolate than before. He was waiting for her, his silhouette a dark, menacing shape in the dimly lit space. "You have it?" he asked, his voice a low growl. Amelia handed him a thick envelope, filled with documents, notes, and diagrams, the culmination of her week-long espionage efforts. He took it, his eyes scanning the contents, his expression unreadable. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the rustling of paper and the distant sounds of the city. Amelia's heart pounded in her chest, her anxiety growing with each passing moment. She had risked everything to obtain this information, betrayed her country, compromised her integrity. Would it be enough? Would Silas keep his end of the bargain? Finally, he closed the envelope, his gaze meeting hers. "This is satisfactory," he said, a hint of grudging admiration in his voice. "You've done well, Mrs. Price. Better than I expected." Relief washed over Amelia, a wave of exhaustion mixed with a flicker of hope. "Then you'll tell me?" she asked, her voice trembling. "You'll tell me about Morgan? About Ashworth? About my husband?" Silas nodded slowly. "I keep my promises," he said. "But the truth, Mrs. Price, is rarely simple. And it often comes at a price." He paused, his eyes narrowing. Morgan and Ashworth were partners. In a way, they had a common goal: to control the flow of information, to shape the outcome of the war, to benefit from the chaos. "But Project Nightingale?" Amelia asked. Why would Ashworth sabotage his own project? "It wasn't his project," Silas corrected. "It was Morgan's." Ashworth saw it as a threat to his power, to his influence. He wanted it stopped. And he used Morgan to do it. "Used him?" Amelia repeated, confused. "Morgan was conflicted," Silas explained. "He believed in the project, in its potential to save lives. But he also owed Ashworth. Owed him everything. His career, his position, his life." He paused, his gaze meeting hers. Ashworth had something on him. Something dark. Something from Morgan's past. A secret that could destroy him. "What secret?" Amelia asked, her voice barely a whisper. Silas hesitated, his eyes flickering towards the entrance of the warehouse, as if checking for eavesdroppers. "It involved a woman," he said finally. "A woman Morgan loved. A woman who died. Under suspicious circumstances." Ashworth knew the truth. And he used it to blackmail Morgan. To force him to betray his own project. "To betray your husband." Amelia felt a chill run down her spine. Another layer of the mystery revealed. Another layer of betrayal and deception. Morgan, a victim as well as a perpetrator, a man trapped by his past, forced to make an impossible choice. And Thomas? Amelia asked, her voice trembling. "What happened to him?" Silas looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of pity and regret. "He was a good man, Mrs. Price. A brave man. He refused to cooperate. He tried to expose Ashworth, to warn the others. But it was too late." "He's dead?" Amelia asked, the word a painful whisper, though she already knew the answer. Silas nodded slowly. "He was killed. By Morgan's men. On Ashworth's orders."
"I'm sorry."
The confirmation. It broke something inside Amelia, but it also steeled her resolve. "Where is Morgan now?" she asked, her voice, surprisingly, had grown steadier. "Where can I find him?" Silas smiled, a cold, knowing smile.
He's gone, Mrs. Price.
Vanished. Just like he always does. But I know where he'll be. He always returns to the place where it all began. To Ashworth Manor. He looked straight into her eyes. He'll be there waiting. For the reckoning. The price had been paid. The truth, as bitter as it was, had been revealed. Amelia had her answer. She had her vengeance.
And now?
She had her purpose. Chapter 11. Treachery in the Ranks. Silas's information, the confirmation of Thomas's death and the revelation of Morgan's forced betrayal, had fueled Amelia's determination. She would go to Ashworth Manor, confront the man responsible for her husband's murder, and uncover the full extent of the conspiracy that had cost so many lives. But she knew she couldn't do it alone. She needed help, someone she could trust, someone who had the skills and the knowledge to navigate the dangerous world of Ashworth Manor. Her thoughts turned back to Lieutenant Davies, the young officer who had initially warned her about Morgan and who had provided her with the crucial information about Project Nightingale and Lord Ashworth's involvement. She sought him out again, meeting him in a secluded corner of St. James's Park, the autumn leaves swirling around them like fallen secrets. She told him everything about her deal with Silas, about the information she had obtained, about her plan to go to Ashworth Manor. Davies listened intently, his expression growing increasingly grave. "This is insane, Mrs. Price," he said finally. "Ashworth is a powerful man. He's protected. You can't just walk into his estate and confront him." "I have to," Amelia insisted. "I have to know the truth. I have to bring him to justice." Davies hesitated, his gaze flickering towards the distant figures strolling through the park. "There's something else," he said finally, his voice low. "Something I haven't told you. Something I discovered after our last meeting." "What is it?" Amelia asked, her heart pounding in her chest. I did some more digging," Davies continued. "About Project Nightingale. About the leak. And I found something disturbing. Something that implicates someone else." "Who?" Amelia pressed, her voice barely a whisper. Davies looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of disbelief and horror. It wasn't just Ashworth," he said. "There was another traitor. Someone within the project itself. Someone close to Morgan. Someone he trusted." Amelia's mind raced. Another traitor? Someone within Project Nightingale?
Who could it be? Who was it?
She asked again, her voice trembling. Davies hesitated, his gaze meeting hers. "It was Silas," he said, the name a heavy weight in the air. Silas was working with Ashworth. He was the informant. He was the one who betrayed them all. The revelation hit Amelia like a physical blow, knocking the wind out of her. Silas? The man who had claimed to be Morgan's former associate, the man who had promised to help her, the man who had given her the information about Ashworth? He was the traitor? It all made sense now, the cryptic questions, the demand for information about Project Nightingale, the careful manipulation. He had used her, played her, used her grief and her determination to further his own agenda, to protect himself and Ashworth. "I don't believe it," Amelia stammered, her mind reeling. "I have proof," Davies said, pulling out a small, folded piece of paper from his pocket. "It's a coded message, intercepted by a colleague of mine. It's from Silas to Ashworth, confirming the delivery of information about Project Nightingale, about your husband." Amelia took the message, her hands trembling. She recognized the code, a simple substitution cipher that Thomas had taught her, a game they had played in happier times. She quickly deciphered the message, her heart sinking with each word she read. The message confirmed everything Davies had said. Silas was the traitor. He had betrayed Thomas, betrayed the project, betrayed her. "I have to go," Amelia said, her voice shaking. "I have to warn Morgan. I have to stop Silas." Davies grabbed her arm, his grip firm. "No," he said. "It's too dangerous. You can't go alone. Let me call for backup. We'll go together." Amelia, with a sad look, pulled her arm away. "There's no time," she said, her voice filled with a desperate urgency. "Silas, he knows I'm going to Ashworth Manor. He'll be expecting me. He'll be waiting. I have to get there first, before it is too late." She looked up, the park, the sky, it all seemed so distant. I have to do this, Lieutenant. Alone. The treachery was deeper than she could have imagined. And time, as always, was short. Chapter 12. The Escape to Dover. Amelia knew that going to Ashworth Manor alone was a reckless, almost suicidal plan. But she felt a desperate urgency, a need to confront Silas, to warn Morgan, to somehow salvage the situation, to bring the true traitor to justice. She raced back to her home, her mind reeling, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and determination. She packed a small bag, throwing in a few essentials, a change of clothes, a small amount of money, the photograph of Thomas, and the loaded revolver she had hidden beneath the floorboards, a relic from her father's time in the army, a weapon she had never thought she would have to use. She knew that Ashworth Manor was heavily guarded, that she would have to find a way to get past the security, to reach Morgan before Silas did. She remembered Eleanor mentioning that Morgan used the old family carriage for secret meetings, for transporting sensitive materials, for disappearing. If she could find the carriage, it might provide a way to get onto the estate undetected. She remembered the location where she had first seen the carriage, the deserted stretch of road near Blackheath Common. She hurried there, her footsteps echoing in the silence of the night, the fog swirling around her like a shroud. She waited, hidden in the shadows, her eyes scanning the road, her senses on high alert. The minutes stretched into an eternity, each tick of the clock a hammer blow against her dwindling hope. She began to doubt herself, to wonder if she was chasing a phantom, a figment of her grief-stricken imagination. And then she saw it. The carriage, emerging from the fog like a ghost from the past, its black lacquered wood gleaming faintly in the dim light, its two black stallions silent and motionless. But this time, it wasn't empty. A figure sat on the driver's box, a tall, imposing figure wrapped in a long, dark coat, his face hidden in shadow. It was Morgan. Amelia stepped out of the shadows, her heart pounding in her chest. "Captain Morgan," she called out, her voice trembling. The carriage stopped, the horses remaining eerily still. Morgan turned his head, his eyes, dark and piercing, meeting hers. He didn't speak, merely raised an eyebrow, a silent question. I need to talk to you," Amelia said, her voice urgent. "It's about Project Nightingale. About Silas. About my husband." Morgan's expression didn't change, but a flicker of something recognition, perhaps, or suspicion crossed his eyes. He gestured towards the carriage door, a silent invitation. Amelia hesitated, her mind racing. Was this a trap? Was Morgan still working with Ashworth? Could she trust him? But she had no choice. She had come too far to turn back now. She had to take the risk. She climbed into the carriage, the interior dark and claustrophobic, the air thick with the scent of leather and something else, something metallic, the familiar scent of blood and secrets. Morgan didn't speak, merely flicked the reins, and the horses began to move, their hooves silent on the fog-shrouded road. They were heading away from London, towards the coast, towards Ashworth Manor. "Silas is the traitor," Amelia said, breaking the silence, her voice trembling. "He's working with Ashworth. He betrayed Project Nightingale. He killed my husband." Morgan remained silent, his gaze fixed on the road ahead. Amelia couldn't read his expression, couldn't tell if he believed her, if he cared. "Lieutenant Davies, he intercepted a message," Amelia continued, recounting the details of the coded message, the proof of Silas's treachery.
He knows everything."
Finally, Morgan spoke, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "I know," he said. Amelia was taken aback. "You know?" "I suspected," Morgan replied. "Silas was always ambitious. Greedy. I should have seen it sooner. But why didn't you do anything?" Amelia asked, her voice filled with a mixture of anger and confusion. "I couldn't," Morgan said, his voice heavy with regret. "Ashworth had something on me. A secret from my past. He was blackmailing me, forcing me to cooperate." "The woman," Amelia said, remembering what Silas had told her. "The woman who died." Morgan nodded slowly, his gaze darkening. "Her name was Isabel," he said, the name a painful whisper.
She was everything to me.
Ashworth, he knew the truth about her death.
He used it to control me.
But why would he sabotage Project Nightingale? Amelia asked. What did he gain? Power, Morgan replied, his voice bitter. Control. He wanted to be the one in charge. He wanted to dictate the terms of the war. He wanted to profit from the chaos. We have to stop him, Amelia said, her voice filled with a renewed determination. We have to expose him. We have to bring him to justice. The carriage started to slow. Morgan turned and spoke with a finality that Amelia could not deny. We will, Morgan said, his eyes meeting hers, a flicker of something that looked like hope in their depths. But first, we need to get to safety. The carriage pulled off the road, into a small, discreet, and dark opening, obscured by trees. We're taking a detour, he explained quietly as he brought the horses to a halt. To Dover. A plan, escape, and, hopefully, a road to redemption. Chapter 13. Across the Channel. The decision to go to Dover was a strategic one, a move to evade Ashworth's reach, and by time to formulate a plan. Morgan explained that Ashworth had eyes and ears everywhere, that staying in England was too dangerous, that they needed to get off the island, to find a place where they could regroup and strategize. The journey to Dover was tense and silent, the carriage rattling along the dark, deserted roads, the only sounds the rhythmic clatter of the horses' hooves and the occasional sigh of the wind. Amelia sat beside Morgan, her mind racing, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and anticipation. She still didn't fully trust him, still couldn't reconcile the image of the haunted, conflicted man with the ruthless spy who had been complicit in her husband's death. But she also saw something else in him, a flicker of vulnerability, a hint of remorse, a desperate need for redemption. She sensed that he was as much a victim of Ashworth's machinations as she was, a pawn in a deadly game, trapped by his past and forced to make impossible choices. As they neared Dover, the sky began to lighten, the first faint streaks of dawn painting the horizon with hues of gray and pink. The fog, which had shrouded them for most of the journey, began to dissipate, revealing the rugged coastline and the choppy waters of the English Channel. Morgan steered the carriage towards a secluded cove, hidden from the main port, a place where smugglers and spies had secretly landed and departed for centuries. He had arranged for a small fishing boat to be waiting for them, a vessel that would take them across the channel to France, to a small, anonymous village near the front lines, a place where they could blend in with the refugees and the displaced, a place where they could find allies and plan their next move. The boat was small and rickety, its wooden hull battered by the wind and waves, its single sail patched and worn. The fisherman, a grizzled old man with weathered skin and wary eyes, greeted them with a nod, accepting the payment Morgan offered without a word. They climbed aboard, Amelia clutching the small bag containing her few possessions, the photograph of Thomas a constant reminder of the purpose of her mission. The boat set sail, the waves slapping against the hull, the wind whipping their faces, the salty spray stinging their eyes. As they left the shores of England behind, Amelia felt a strange sense of liberation, a release from the suffocating atmosphere of London, from the web of secrets and lies that had ensnared her. She was leaving behind everything she knew, venturing into the unknown, but she was also moving closer to the truth, closer to the possibility of justice, closer to a reckoning with the man who had destroyed her life. The journey across the channel was rough and uncomfortable, the small boat tossed about by the waves, the wind howling in their ears. Amelia huddled in the cramped cabin, her stomach churning, her thoughts racing. She wondered what awaited them in France, what dangers they would face, what allies they would find. Morgan sat beside her, his gaze fixed on the horizon, his expression unreadable. He seemed lost in his own thoughts, grappling with his past, his choices, his uncertain future.
Why are you helping me?
Amelia asked, breaking the silence, her voice barely audible above the roar of the wind and waves. Morgan turned his head, his eyes meeting hers. Because it's the right thing to do, he said, his voice low and sincere. Because I owe it to Thomas, to Isabel, to myself. But Ashworth, Amelia said. He has power. Influence. He can destroy you.
Morgan smiled. A sad, weary smile.
He already has, he said. He's taken everything from me. My reputation. My love. My peace of mind. There's nothing left for him to take. He paused, his gaze meeting hers. But there's still something I can do. I can expose him. I can bring him to justice. I can make sure he pays for what he's done. The conviction, in those words, stirred something in Amelia. We can, Amelia corrected him. We will. Together. The boat reached the French coast as the sun was rising, casting a golden glow over the war-torn landscape. They had made it. They had crossed the channel. They had escaped. But the real battle, Amelia knew, was just about to begin. Chapter 14. The Field Hospital of Verdun. The French village where Morgan had arranged for them to land was a desolate, shell-shocked place, a testament to the brutal realities of the war. Buildings lay in ruins, streets were cratered with shell holes, and the air hung heavy with the scent of smoke, decay, and death. The villagers, their faces etched with weariness and grief, moved like ghosts through the debris, their lives shattered by the relentless conflict. Morgan led Amelia through the ravaged streets, his familiarity with the area suggesting that this was not his first visit. He seemed to know where to go, who to avoid, how to blend in with the flow of refugees and displaced persons who thronged the village, seeking shelter and safety. He took her to a small, dilapidated building on the outskirts of the village, a former schoolhouse that had been converted into a makeshift field hospital. The building was overcrowded, filled with wounded soldiers, their bodies broken and bleeding, their cries of pain echoing through the corridors. The air was thick with the smell of antiseptic, blood, and unwashed bodies. A harried-looking nurse, her uniform stained with blood and sweat, greeted them at the entrance. She looked at them with suspicion, her eyes narrowed. We need a place to stay, Morgan said, his voice low and urgent. We can help. We can work. The nurse hesitated, her gaze sweeping over them, assessing their appearance, their demeanor. She seemed to recognize something in Morgan's eyes, a hint of desperation, a flicker of authority. Very well, she said finally, her voice weary. But you'll have to work. We're short-staffed. Overwhelmed. Every pair of hands is needed. She led them to a small, cramped room at the back of the building, a former classroom that had been converted into a makeshift dormitory. The room was filled with cots, occupied by sleeping soldiers, their bodies restless and twitching, their dreams haunted by the horrors of the war. You can stay here, the nurse said, but you'll have to share. And you'll have to work. The wounded need care. The dead need burying. There's no shortage of work to be done. She left them alone, the sounds of the hospital, the cries of pain, the moans of the dying, the hurried footsteps of the medical staff filling the silence. Amelia looked around the room, her heart heavy with the weight of the suffering she saw around her. She had witnessed the horrors of war in London, in the faces of the wounded soldiers returning from the front, in the growing lists of casualties in the newspapers, in the empty chair at her own dinner table. But this was different. This was the raw, brutal reality of the battlefield, the immediate aftermath of the carnage, the human cost of the conflict laid bare. Morgan sat down on one of the cots, his head in his hands, his body shaking. He seemed overwhelmed by the suffering, by the memories it evoked, by the guilt he carried. Amelia sat beside him, her hand reaching out to touch his shoulder, a gesture of comfort, of solidarity. We'll get through this, she said, her voice soft but firm. We'll find a way to make things right. Morgan looked up at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and despair. I don't know if we can, he said, his voice barely a whisper. Ashworth, he's too powerful. He's got everyone in his pocket. Not everyone, Amelia said, her voice filled with a renewed determination. There are good people out there. People who believe in justice. People who will help us. She paused, her gaze meeting his. We have to find them. We have to build a network. We have to gather evidence. We have to expose Ashworth. We have to bring him down. Morgan, with a sigh, nodded. We need allies, Amelia said. And we need information. They spent the next few days working in the field hospital, tending to the wounded, burying the dead, witnessing the horrors of war firsthand. Amelia, despite her lack of medical training, proved to be a capable and compassionate caregiver, her gentle touch and her soothing words bringing comfort to the suffering soldiers. Morgan, with his military experience, was able to assist with the more difficult tasks, setting broken bones, stitching wounds, helping to maintain order in the chaotic environment. They worked and they planned.
And they watched.
Verdun was close. And in the heart of the war zone, a chance for the truth to finally come out. Chapter 15. Amidst the ruins. The field hospital, despite its grim surroundings and the constant influx of wounded, became a strange sanctuary for Amelia and Morgan. It was a place where they could lose themselves in the work, where they could find a sense of purpose amidst the chaos, where they could forge a bond of shared experience and mutual respect. They worked tirelessly, day and night, tending to the physical and emotional wounds of the soldiers, witnessing the resilience of the human spirit in the face of unimaginable suffering. They saw men die with courage, men cling to life with desperate hope, men find solace in the smallest acts of kindness. Amidst the ruins of war, they also found moments of quiet connection, stolen conversations in the brief respites between the waves of casualties, shared glances across the crowded wards, a silent understanding that transcended words. They began to talk, to share their stories, to reveal the vulnerabilities they had kept hidden for so long. Morgan spoke of Isabel, of his love for her, of the circumstances surrounding her death, of the guilt he had carried for years, of the way Ashworth had used that guilt to manipulate him, to control him, to force him to betray his own principles. Amelia spoke of Thomas, of their life together, of their dreams for the future, of the emptiness she had felt since his disappearance, of the burning need for justice that had driven her across the channel, into the heart of the war. They discovered that they were both haunted by the past, burdened by secrets, driven by a desire for redemption. They found solace in each other's company, a shared understanding that eased the loneliness and the pain. But they also knew that their sanctuary was temporary, that they couldn't stay hidden in the field hospital forever, that they had a mission to complete, a reckoning to face. They began to gather information, to build a network of contacts, to seek out allies who could help them expose Ashworth and bring him to justice. They spoke to the wounded soldiers, listening to their stories, gleaning fragments of information about the war, about the corruption that permeated the military hierarchy, about the rumors of a secret project that had gone terribly wrong. They also made contact with the local resistance, a group of French civilians who were working to undermine the German occupation, to sabotage their war efforts, to gather intelligence for the Allied forces. The resistance fighters were wary at first, suspicious of the two strangers who had appeared in their midst, but Morgan's military experience and Amelia's unwavering determination eventually won them over. The resistance provided them with valuable information, with contacts, with resources, with a safe haven where they could plan their next move. They learned that Ashworth was planning a visit to the front lines, a propaganda tour designed to boost morale and to solidify his political position. He would be traveling with a small entourage, heavily guarded, but vulnerable nonetheless. It was a risky opportunity, a chance to confront Ashworth directly, to expose his treachery, to bring him to justice. But it was also a dangerous one, a move that could cost them their lives. "We have to do it," Amelia said, her voice firm, her eyes filled with a steely resolve. "We have to take the chance. We have to make him pay." Morgan hesitated, his gaze flickering towards the distant sounds of artillery fire.
"It's suicide," he said.
"He'll be surrounded by guards. We'll never get close to him." "We have to try," Amelia insisted. "We have allies now. The resistance, they can help us. They can create a diversion. They can get us close." The planning began. Amelia knew, looking at the ruins, the broken buildings, the shell craters, that it all came down to this. A confrontation. In a broken world. With a broken man. And Morgan, his own doubts and demons battled nightly, looked at her, and finally nodded. The ruins of Verdun would bear witness to a reckoning. Chapter 16. A promise broken. The plan was audacious, bordering on reckless, but it was the only chance they had. Ashworth was scheduled to visit a forward observation post near Verdun, a heavily fortified position that offered a panoramic view of the battlefield. The resistance would create a diversion, a staged attack on a nearby supply depot, drawing away some of the guards and creating an opportunity for Amelia and Morgan to infiltrate the observation post. They spent days preparing, studying maps, memorizing the layout of the observation post, rehearsing their roles, anticipating every possible contingency. They knew that the slightest mistake could cost them their lives, that they were walking into a trap, but they were driven by a fierce determination, by a need for justice, by a desire to avenge the deaths of Thomas and the other men who had been betrayed by Ashworth. The day of Ashworth's visit arrived, the sky overcast and gray, the air thick with the smell of smoke and cordite. The sounds of artillery fire echoed in the distance, a constant reminder of the brutal realities of the war. Amelia and Morgan, disguised as medical personnel, their faces hidden behind surgical masks, made their way towards the observation post, their hearts pounding in their chests, their senses on high alert. The resistance had already launched their diversionary attack, the sounds of explosions and gunfire drawing away some of the guards, creating a chaotic atmosphere. They reached the observation post, the entrance guarded by two stern-faced soldiers, their rifles at the ready. Morgan, using his military bearing and a forged set of orders, managed to convince the guards to let them pass, claiming that they were there to attend to a wounded officer. They entered the observation post, the interior dark and cramped, the air thick with the smell of sweat and fear. They could hear Ashworth's voice, booming from a nearby room, delivering a speech to a group of officers, his words filled with patriotic fervor and empty promises. Amelia and Morgan exchanged a glance, a silent understanding passing between them. This was it, the moment of truth. They moved towards the room where Ashworth was speaking, their footsteps silent on the concrete floor. They reached the doorway, their hands hovering over the weapons they had concealed beneath their medical coats. But as they were about to enter, they heard another voice, a voice that made Amelia's blood run cold. It was Silas. "Lord Ashworth," Silas said, his voice smooth and deferential. "I have news about Morgan and the woman." Amelia and Morgan froze, their bodies pressed against the wall, their ears straining to hear the conversation within. "What news?" Ashworth demanded, his voice sharp and impatient. "They're here," Silas replied. "In Verdun. They're planning to expose you, to bring you down." Amelia felt a wave of despair wash over her. Silas had betrayed them again. He had anticipated their move, warned Ashworth, set a trap for them. "Find them," Ashworth ordered, his voice filled with a cold fury. "And kill them. Both of them." Amelia and Morgan knew they had to escape, to get out of the observation post before Silas and Ashworth's guards found them. But as they turned to leave, they saw Silas standing in the doorway, his gun drawn, his eyes filled with a cold, calculating gleam. "Going somewhere?" he asked, his voice a mocking sneer. Amelia and Morgan were trapped, cornered, their plan foiled, their hopes dashed. Silas had outmaneuvered them, betrayed them once again. You were supposed to be helping us," Amelia said, her voice trembling, her heart filled with a bitter sense of betrayal. Silas smiled, a cruel, heartless smile.
"I was helping myself," he said.
"Always. That's the way the game is played, Mrs. Price. And you were just a pawn." He raised his gun, his finger tightening on the trigger. Amelia closed her eyes, bracing herself for the inevitable. She had failed.
Thomas. Morgan.
Herself. All lost. But then, the sound that rung through was not a gunshot. It was a yell and a thud. Silas looked shocked, staring downwards at the knife protruding from his chest. Morgan stood behind him, a look of pure fury on his face. It was done. The promise broken was not Amelia's to Thomas. It was Morgan's to Isabel. He had avenged both in that moment, but the battle had only just begun. Chapter 17. The Interrogation. Silas slumped to the ground, his eyes wide with disbelief, his lifeblood staining the concrete floor. Morgan stood over him, his face a mask of grim determination, the bloody knife still clutched in his hand. Amelia stared at the scene, her mind reeling, her heart pounding with a mixture of shock, relief, and a strange sense of satisfaction. Silas, the traitor, the man who had betrayed them all, was dead. But the danger was far from over. Ashworth was still out there, still in power, still a threat. "We have to go," Morgan said, his voice urgent, snapping Amelia out of her daze. "Ashworth, he knows we're here. He'll be sending his guards." They quickly searched Silas's body, finding a set of keys and a small, leather-bound notebook. The notebook contained a list of names, dates, and locations, a detailed record of Silas's treachery, his dealings with Ashworth, his betrayal of Project Nightingale. It was the evidence they needed, the proof that could expose Ashworth and bring him to justice. But they still had to get out of the observation post, to escape Ashworth's clutches, to find a way to make the evidence public. They made their way through the corridors of the observation post, moving stealthily, avoiding the guards, their senses on high alert. They could hear the sounds of shouting and running footsteps, the evidence of a chaos that Silas's death had caused. They reached a side exit, a small, unmarked door that led to a narrow alleyway behind the observation post. Morgan used the keys they had found on Silas's body to unlock the door, and they slipped out into the alleyway, the cool night air a welcome relief from the stifling atmosphere of the observation post. But as they were about to make their escape, they heard a voice, Ashworth's voice, booming from a nearby loudspeaker. "Morgan! Amelia!" Ashworth's voice echoed through the alleyway. "I know you're out there. You can't escape. Surrender, and I promise you a quick death. Resist, and you'll suffer." Amelia and Morgan exchanged a glance. They were trapped, surrounded, their escape route blocked. Ashworth had them cornered. "We have to fight," Amelia said, her voice filled with a desperate courage. "We have nothing to lose." Morgan nodded, his grip tightening on the knife he had taken from Silas.
"We fight," he said.
Together. They prepared for the inevitable confrontation, their backs against the wall, their weapons ready, their hearts pounding with a mixture of fear and defiance. They would face Ashworth, face his guards, fight for their lives, fight for justice, fight for the memory of Thomas and the other men who had been betrayed. But then, they heard another sound, a sound that made their hearts leap with hope. It was the sound of gunfire, but it wasn't coming from Ashworth's guards. It was coming from the resistance, from the allies they had made in the field hospital, from the people who believed in justice, from the people who were willing to fight for freedom. The resistance fighters, led by the grizzled old fisherman who had brought them across the channel, had launched a surprise attack on the observation post, creating a diversion, drawing away Ashworth's guards, giving Amelia and Morgan a chance to escape. The alleyway erupted in a hail of gunfire, the sounds of shouting and explosions filling the air. Amelia and Morgan seized the opportunity, running through the chaos, dodging bullets, fighting their way towards freedom. They reached the edge of the alleyway, where the resistance fighters were waiting for them, their faces grim and determined. The fisherman grabbed Amelia's arm, pulling her towards a waiting vehicle, a battered old truck that had seen better days.
"Get in,"
he shouted above the din of battle. "We'll get you out of here." Amelia and Morgan climbed into the back of the truck, the resistance fighters piling in after them. The truck roared to life, speeding away from the observation post, leaving behind the chaos and the carnage, leaving behind Ashworth and his shattered ambitions. They were safe for now, but the fight was far from over. They had the evidence, they had allies, but they still had to find a way to expose Ashworth, to bring him to justice, to make sure that his treachery would never be repeated. They were driven to a small, remote farmhouse. Far from the fighting, Morgan, his face pale and streaked with dirt, turned to Amelia.
"Now," he said, his voice firm.
"We interrogate Ashworth." The truck had stopped. Amelia nodded. The farmhouse was silent. But she knew not for long. Chapter 18. The Price of Freedom. The farmhouse was a haven, a temporary refuge from the chaos and violence of the war. It was a simple, rustic dwelling, its walls thick with stone, its roof thatched with straw, its interior furnished with rough-hewn furniture and the bare essentials of rural life. But it offered warmth, shelter, and a sense of peace that Amelia and Morgan had not experienced in days. The resistance fighters, their faces weary but resolute, had brought them food and water, had tended to their minor wounds, had offered them a brief respite from the constant threat of danger. They had also brought them a prisoner, Lord Ashworth. Ashworth had been captured during the chaotic battle at the observation post, subdued by the resistance fighters and brought to the farmhouse, his hands bound, his face bruised and bloodied, his arrogant demeanor shattered. He sat on a rough-hewn chair in the center of the main room, his eyes darting around the room, his expression a mixture of fear, anger, and disbelief. Amelia and Morgan stood before him, their faces grim and determined, their hearts pounding with a mixture of anticipation and trepidation. This was the moment they had been waiting for, the moment of reckoning, the chance to confront the man who had destroyed their lives, the man who had betrayed his country, the man who had caused so much suffering. Lord Ashworth, Amelia said, her voice steady but trembling. We know the truth. We know about Project Nightingale. We know about Silas. We know about my husband. Ashworth glared at her, his eyes filled with a cold fury. You know nothing, he spat. You're delusional. You're traitors. You'll pay for this. We have proof, Morgan said, stepping forward, his voice low and menacing. He held up the leather-bound notebook they had taken from Silas's body. This contains everything. Your dealings with Silas. Your sabotage of Project Nightingale. Your orders to kill Thomas Price. Ashworth's face paled, his eyes widening with a flicker of fear. He had underestimated them, underestimated their determination, underestimated their ability to uncover the truth. That's a forgery, he stammered. It's lies. You can't prove anything. We can, Amelia said, her voice rising with anger. We have witnesses. We have the resistance fighters. We have Lieutenant Davies. We have the coded messages. We have everything we need to expose you. She paused, her gaze meeting his. Why? Lord Ashworth, why did you do it? Why did you betray your country? Why did you kill innocent men? Ashworth hesitated, his arrogance crumbling, his bravado fading. He looked at Amelia, at Morgan, at the resistance fighters who surrounded him, their faces grim and unforgiving. He knew he was trapped, cornered, his lies exposed, his power shattered. It was for the greater good, he said finally, his voice barely a whisper. I believed Project Nightingale was a mistake, a waste of resources, a danger to our national security. I had to stop it. You killed innocent men, Amelia repeated, her voice filled with a cold fury. You killed my husband. You destroyed lives. For what? For power? For money? For your own twisted sense of patriotism? Ashworth didn't answer, his gaze dropping to the floor, his body shaking with a mixture of fear and shame. You'll pay for what you've done, Morgan said, his voice filled with a quiet intensity. You'll face justice. You'll be held accountable for your crimes. The resistance fighters stepped forward, their hands tightening on their weapons. They were ready to carry out their own form of justice, to execute the man who had caused so much suffering, to avenge the deaths of their comrades, to protect their country from further betrayal. Amelia spoke first. No, Amelia said, her voice surprisingly calm, her gaze fixed on Ashworth. That's not what Thomas would have wanted. He believed in justice, not revenge. He believed in the rule of law, not vigilante justice. She looked out the window, towards the front. He must be handed to the authorities, to stand trial for his crimes. The proper way. She paused, her voice filled with a deep sadness. We can't become like him. We can't sink to his level. We have to be better than that. We have to uphold the values that Thomas died for. Morgan nodded, his gaze meeting hers, a flicker of understanding passing between them. He knew she was right. They couldn't let their anger, their grief, their desire for revenge consume them. They had to uphold the principles of justice, of fairness, of the rule of law, even in the face of such profound betrayal. The resistance fighters hesitated, their anger simmering, their desire for revenge palpable. But they also respected Amelia, respected her courage, respected her commitment to justice. They lowered their weapons, reluctantly agreeing to her decision. Ashworth would be handed over to the authorities to face trial for his crimes. He would be held accountable for his actions, his treachery exposed, his reputation shattered. He would pay the price of freedom, the price of betrayal, the price of his twisted ambition. The justice would be served properly, but it would not bring back those lost.
It was a start, though.
A flicker of light in a very dark world. Chapter 19. The Return to Blackheath. The journey back to England was fraught with a quiet tension, a stark contrast to the chaotic escape across the Channel. Ashworth, bound and under constant guard by the resistance fighters, was a subdued, broken man, his arrogance and power stripped away, his future uncertain. Amelia and Morgan, their mission accomplished, their enemy captured, were left to grapple with the emotional aftermath of their ordeal, the weight of their losses, the scars of their experiences. They landed on a secluded beach near Dover, under the cover of darkness, the same beach from which they had fled weeks before. The resistance fighters, their faces grim and determined, handed Ashworth over to a waiting detachment of British soldiers, led by Lieutenant Davies, who had been alerted to their return and had arranged for the arrest. Davies greeted Amelia and Morgan with a mixture of relief and admiration, his eyes filled with respect for their courage and their determination. He assured them that Ashworth would be held accountable for his crimes, that the evidence they had gathered would be used to prosecute him, that justice would be served. As Ashworth was led away, his head bowed in shame, his dreams of power and glory shattered, Amelia felt a sense of closure, a sense of satisfaction, but also a profound sadness. The victory was bittersweet. The cost of justice had been high. The lives lost could never be replaced. Amelia and Morgan were taken to a safe house in London, a discreet location where they could rest and recover, where they could be debriefed by military intelligence, where they could begin to rebuild their lives. They were hailed as heroes, their bravery and their dedication to their country praised by the authorities, their stories celebrated in the newspapers, their names whispered with awe and respect. But Amelia found little solace in the accolades, in the public recognition, in the gratitude of the nation. The war was still raging, the casualties were still mounting, the future was still uncertain. And Thomas was still gone, his absence a constant ache in her heart, his memory a bittersweet reminder of the life they had shared, the future they had lost. She returned to her small, empty house in Blackheath, the place that had once been their home, the place where they had planned their future, the place where they had dreamed of a life together after the war. The house was filled with memories, with ghosts, with the echoes of laughter and love, with the lingering scent of Thomas's pipe tobacco. She wandered through the rooms, her fingers tracing the familiar objects, his worn leather armchair, the chipped teacup he always used, the photograph of them on their wedding day, their faces young and full of hope. She felt a profound sense of loss, a deep emptiness that threatened to consume her. But she also felt something else, a flicker of resilience, a spark of hope, a determination to carry on, to honor Thomas's memory, to live a life worthy of his sacrifice. She had survived the war, survived the betrayals, survived the dangers, survived the grief. She had found strength she hadn't known she possessed, a courage that had surprised even herself. She had found a friend, an ally, a kindred spirit in Morgan, a man who had shared her ordeal, who understood her pain, who had helped her find justice. They had forged a bond in the crucible of war, a connection that transcended their differences, a relationship built on mutual respect, shared loss, and a common purpose. Morgan came one day to the house. He stood awkwardly at the door. He looked at Amelia, a question in his eyes. He had come to say goodbye. His duty was over. Amelia nodded and smiled, but motioned for him to come in. The house, though filled with ghosts, did not feel so empty now. The common, the carriage, it had all started there. And perhaps, Amelia realized, staring out the window towards Blackheath, it would end there too. Chapter 20. Reckoning at Dawn. The invitation to stay was unspoken, but understood. Morgan had come to say goodbye, to return to his own life, to grapple with his own demons, to try to rebuild what was left of his shattered world. But Amelia had extended a hand, a gesture of friendship, a silent offer of companionship, a recognition of the bond they had forged in the crucible of war. He stayed. They spent their days in a quiet routine, a tentative dance of healing and rediscovery. They talked, sharing their memories of Thomas, of Isabel, of the lives they had lost, of the dreams that had been shattered. They found solace in each other's company, a shared understanding that eased the loneliness and the pain. They took long walks on Blackheath Common, the place where their journey had begun, the place where the phantom carriage had first appeared, the place where their lives had been irrevocably changed. The fog still swirled around them, a constant reminder of the secrets and the betrayals they had uncovered, but it no longer held the same sense of menace, the same aura of fear. They had faced the darkness, had confronted the shadows, had brought the truth to light. They had survived. One morning, as dawn was breaking, casting a pale, ethereal light over the common, Amelia found herself drawn to the spot where she had first seen the carriage. She stood there, her breath misting in the cold air, her gaze fixed on the empty space where the carriage had materialized, a phantom from the past. And then she saw it. The carriage, emerging from the mist like a ghost, its black lacquered wood gleaming faintly in the dawn light, its two black stallions silent and motionless. It was real, not a figment of her imagination, not a trick of the fog. Morgan was standing beside her, his presence a comforting warmth in the chill morning air. He had followed her, drawn by the same unspoken impulse, the same need for closure, the same desire for a final reckoning. They approached the carriage, their hearts pounding in their chests, their senses on high alert. The driver's box was empty, the carriage seemingly deserted. But as they drew closer, they saw a figure sitting inside, a figure shrouded in shadow, a figure they both recognized. It was Lord Ashworth. He had escaped. Somehow, he had managed to evade justice, to slip through the cracks of the legal system, to use his wealth and his influence to avoid the consequences of his crimes. He was a broken man, his arrogance gone, his power shattered, his reputation ruined, but he was still free, still a threat. What are you doing here? Amelia asked, her voice trembling, her hand instinctively reaching for the revolver she had carried with her since her return to London. Ashworth looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of defiance and despair. I had to see you, he said, his voice a hoarse whisper. I had to explain. There's nothing to explain, Morgan said, his voice cold and hard. You betrayed your country. You killed innocent men. You destroyed lives. You deserve to rot in prison. I know, Ashworth said, his voice cracking with emotion. I made mistakes. Terrible mistakes. But I wasn't alone. There were others. Others involved. Others who escaped justice. Who? Amelia demanded, her voice rising with anger. Tell us. Tell us their names. Ashworth hesitated, his gaze flickering towards the rising sun, his face etched with a mixture of fear and regret. I can't, he said. They're too powerful. They'll kill me. They'll kill you anyway, Morgan said, his voice relentless. You're a liability. A loose end. They'll silence you. Forever. Ashworth looked at them, his eyes pleading, his body shaking. Help me, he whispered. Please. Help me expose them. Help me make amends. Help me find redemption. Amelia and Morgan exchanged a glance. Could they trust him? Could they believe him? Could they offer him a chance at redemption, a chance to atone for his sins? The decision was not an easy one. Ashworth had caused them so much pain, had betrayed everything they held dear. But he was also a broken man, a man haunted by his past, a man seeking a way out of the darkness. We'll help you, Amelia said finally, her voice firm but compassionate. But you have to tell us everything. You have to name names. You have to reveal the full extent of the conspiracy. You have to help us bring them all to justice." The sun had risen. The fog was clearing. Ashworth nodded, his eyes filled with a flicker of hope. "I will," he said. "I swear. I'll tell you everything." He began to speak, his voice low and hesitant at first, then gaining strength, revealing the names of the other conspirators, the details of their plot, the extent of their treachery. It was a long and harrowing tale, a story of corruption, betrayal, and murder, a story that reached the highest echelons of power, a story that threatened to shake the very foundations of the British government. The names, the places, the dates. It was all coming out. As Ashworth spoke, a sense of closure washed over Amelia, a feeling of peace she had not known since before the war. The truth was finally being revealed, the secrets were being exposed, the reckoning was at hand. But as the sun rose higher in the sky, casting its golden rays over the common, they saw them. Figures, emerging from the dissipating fog, their faces grim and determined, their weapons drawn. Ashworth's allies, or former allies. They had come to silence him, forever. The final reckoning had arrived. At dawn. Epilogue. The confrontation on Blackheath Common was swift and brutal, a final, desperate clash between the forces of darkness and the flickering light of truth. Ashworth's former allies, men of power and influence, had come to silence him, to bury the secrets he was about to reveal, to protect their own positions and escape justice. But they had underestimated Amelia and Morgan, underestimated their courage, their determination, their resilience. They had also underestimated the loyalty of Lieutenant Davies, who had been tracking Ashworth's movements, anticipating his escape, and had arrived on the common with a detachment of soldiers, ready to intervene. The battle was short but fierce, a chaotic exchange of gunfire and hand-to-hand combat, the sounds of violence echoing across the tranquil expanse of the common. Amelia and Morgan fought side by side, their skills honed by their wartime experiences, their determination fueled by their shared loss and their unwavering commitment to justice. Ashworth, caught in the crossfire, made a final, desperate attempt to redeem himself, shielding Amelia from a bullet, sacrificing his own life to save hers. His last words, whispered with his dying breath, were the names of the remaining conspirators, the final pieces of the puzzle, the key to exposing the full extent of the treachery. The battle ended with the arrival of Davies and his soldiers, the remaining conspirators captured or killed, the threat extinguished, the secrets revealed. Ashworth's death, though tragic, was a form of redemption, a final act of atonement for his sins. The aftermath of the confrontation brought a wave of arrests, trials, and public outrage. The conspiracy that had reached the highest levels of power was exposed. The guilty were brought to justice. The foundations of the government were shaken, but ultimately, the truth prevailed. Amelia and Morgan were hailed as heroes once again, their bravery and their dedication to their country celebrated, their names etched in the annals of wartime history. But they sought no accolades, no public recognition, no rewards. They had done what they had to do, had fought for justice, had honored the memory of those they had lost. They returned to Blackheath, to the small house that had once been Amelia's home, the house that had become a sanctuary, a place of healing, a place of shared memories. They had both been changed by the war, scarred by their experiences, burdened by their losses, but they had also found strength, courage, and a profound connection with each other. The phantom carriage never appeared again. It was as if its purpose had been fulfilled, its ghostly presence no longer needed, its secrets revealed, its mission accomplished. The war eventually ended, the guns fell silent, the world began to heal, but the scars remained, the memories lingered, the lessons learned. Amelia and Morgan built a life together, a quiet life, a life filled with love, companionship, and a shared commitment to making the world a better place. They never forgot Thomas or Isabel or the countless others who had been lost in the war, but they also found a way to move forward, to embrace the future, to find hope amidst the ruins. They found, in each other, a second chance at happiness, A love born in the crucible of war, a bond forged in the fires of adversity, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. They married the following spring
and lived
together, quietly. The echoes of the war always remained, but so too did the love. The end.